The snow fell thick and silent across the Montana plains when Jake Martinez first heard the howling that would change his life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. It was 3 in the morning on a February night so cold that his breath formed clouds even inside the barn, and the sound that cut through the wind was not the usual coyote calls he knew by heart. This was deeper, more primal, the kind of sound that made every muscle in his body tense with ancient fear. Standing in the doorway of his weathered barn, Jake could see nothing beyond the wall of white that had been falling for 18 hours straight. The storm was the worst he had seen in 15 years of working this remote ranch, and it had already claimed 2 of his prize cattle to the cold. But the howling told him that cold was not the only predator hunting in the darkness tonight. The first thing you need to understand about Crow Valley, Montana, is that it sits at the edge of 2 worlds. To the east, rolling plains stretch toward civilization, dotted with ranches and small towns where people live predictable lives governed by seasons and cattle prices. To the west, the wilderness begins, thousands of acres of untamed forest where ancient laws still govern and modern boundaries mean nothing to the creatures that call it home. Jake Martinez had chosen this boundary deliberately when he bought the failing ranch 5 years ago. He needed distance from the world that had tried to cage him, needed space to rebuild something that resembled peace from the wreckage of his former life. The isolation suited him. Most days he saw no one but his horses and cattle, and that was exactly how he preferred it. The ranch house was a simple 2-story structure built in the 1940s, solid and functional with none of the modern conveniences that city people thought necessary. Jake had restored it himself, board by board, learning carpentry and plumbing through trial and error, finding satisfaction in work that produced tangible results. After years of dealing with abstractions and politics and the kind of problems that had no clear solutions, fixing a broken fence or mending a roof felt like meditation. He was not a large man, standing maybe 5'10" with the lean build of someone who worked hard for a living. But there was something in his dark eyes that suggested depths most people never suspected. His black hair, now touched with gray at the temples, was usually hidden beneath a worn baseball cap, and his hands were permanently stained with the honest dirt of ranch work. Most people in Crow Valley knew Jake Martinez as the quiet man who kept to himself and paid his bills on time, which was enough to earn respect in a place where privacy was valued above friendliness. What they did not know was that Jake Martinez had once been Detective Miguel Martinez of the Denver Police Department, a man who had spent 12 years believing that justice was something you could achieve through procedure and persistence and careful attention to evidence. What they did not know was that he had learned the hard way that some forms of justice required choices that the law could not accommodate, and that sometimes the price of doing the right thing was everything you thought you knew about yourself. The blizzard had started at sunset, gentle flakes that quickly became a torrent of white that erased the familiar landmarks of his property. Jake had spent the evening moving his livestock to shelter, checking water lines that were already beginning to freeze, and preparing for what the Weather Service was calling a once-in-a-decade storm. By midnight, the world outside his windows had become an alien landscape where familiar shapes disappeared into drifts that reached halfway up his porch steps. He was banking the fire in his living room when the first howl cut through the wind. Jake froze, his hand still holding the poker, every instinct he had developed in 5 years of ranch life telling him that this was not a sound that belonged in his valley. He moved to the window and peered out into the swirling darkness, seeing nothing but snow and shadows that could have been anything. The second howl came from a different direction, closer to the house. Jake reached for the rifle that hung above the fireplace, checking the chamber out of habit before moving to the front door. He had dealt with coyotes before, and even the occasional mountain lion, but this sound was different. Larger, more organized, more intelligent in a way that made his skin crawl with recognition. When the third howl answered the first two, Jake realized he was not dealing with random predators driven to his property by hunger and desperation. This was a pack, coordinated and purposeful, and they were surrounding his house with the methodical precision of hunters who knew exactly what they were doing. He was reaching for his phone to call the sheriff when he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Through the howling wind and the constant whisper of falling snow, he heard a child crying. Jake yanked open the front door, and the wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face and making his eyes water instantly. But through the white chaos, he could make out shapes moving across his front yard. Small figures stumbling through drifts that came up to their waists, moving toward his porch with the desperate urgency of people running for their lives. 3 children emerged from the blizzard like something out of a nightmare or a dream. 2 boys and a girl, none of them older than 10, wearing clothes that were completely inadequate for the storm. The oldest, a boy with long black hair plastered to his skull by melting snow, was carrying the youngest child, a girl who could not have been more than 6. The third child, another boy, was limping badly, leaving dark spots in the snow that Jake realized with horror were drops of blood. Behind them, maybe 50 yards out in the swirling darkness, Jake could see the wolves. 7 of them, moving through the snow with the fluid grace of apex predators, their eyes reflecting the light from his porch like scattered stars. They were not attacking, not yet, but they were herding the children toward the house with an intelligence that defied everything Jake thought he knew about wild animal behavior. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pack leader was larger than the others, a massive gray and black wolf that moved with the confidence of an animal that had never been challenged by anything in its domain. When it looked directly at Jake standing in his doorway, he felt something pass between them, a communication that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the primal understanding that separated predator from prey. Jake did not hesitate. He stepped out into the storm, raised his rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder, and for a moment, the wolves stopped their advance. But they did not retreat. Instead, the pack leader sat down in the snow and watched Jake with what could only be described as curiosity, as if this human with his loud noisemaker was an interesting development rather than a serious threat. "Get inside," Jake called to the children, his voice barely audible over the wind. Now, the oldest boy understood immediately, half carrying, half dragging his companions up the porch steps and through the front door. Jake followed, slamming the door behind them and throwing the heavy deadbolt that he had installed, but never thought he would actually need. In the sudden warmth and light of his living room, Jake got his first clear look at the 3 children, who had appeared out of the storm like refugees from another world. They were Native American, with the dark hair and distinctive features that suggested they belonged to one of the local tribes, but their clothes were not the practical winter gear that any Montana child would wear in February. Instead, they wore what looked like traditional clothing, leather and wool and intricate beadwork, beautiful but utterly useless against sub-zero temperatures and 3 feet of snow. The oldest boy, who Jake estimated to be about 9 or 10, stood protectively in front of the other 2, his dark eyes alert and intelligent despite his obvious exhaustion. He spoke in a language Jake did not recognize, rapid words that sounded like questions or explanations, directed at the other children rather than at Jake. The injured boy was maybe 8, with a gash on his leg that was still bleeding through his torn leggings. He was trying not to cry, but Jake could see the pain and fear in his young face. The little girl, who could not have been more than 6, clung to the oldest boy's hand and stared at Jake with enormous dark eyes that held far too Much knowledge for someone her age. Jake knelt down to their level, moving slowly to avoid frightening them further. Do any of you speak English? The oldest boy nodded carefully. Some, not much. Where are your parents? Where did you come from? The boy looked at his companions, then back at Jake, clearly struggling with how to explain something that seemed to have no easy explanation. We were walking. In the old way. The ceremony. Then the storm came, and we got lost. The wolves found. U.S. Jake felt pieces clicking together in his mind, though the picture they formed made no sense. Ceremony suggested something traditional, something that might require specific clothing and specific routes through the wilderness, but no modern. Native family would send children into a Montana blizzard wearing traditional dress, no matter how important the ceremony might be. The little girl tugged on the older boy's sleeve and whispered something in their native language. The boy nodded and turned back to Jake. She wants to know if the wolves are still outside. Are they still outside? Jake moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. The pack was still there, 7 dark shapes arranged in a rough circle around his house. They were not pacing or showing signs of agitation like animals waiting for an opportunity to attack. Instead, they sat motionless in the falling snow, watching the house with the patience of creatures that had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. Yes, Jake said, though he was not sure why that should be surprising. The boy translated for the others, and all 3 children nodded as if this was exactly what they had expected to hear. Jake realized that whatever was happening here, it was far more complicated than a simple case of children lost in a storm being pursued by hungry wolves. There was an undercurrent of inevitability in the children's behavior, as if being hunted by a wolf pack was not an unexpected disaster, but a natural consequence of something larger they were involved in. The injured boy was shivering violently. Now and Jake could see that his leg wound was worse than he had initially thought. The bleeding had slowed, but the boy's lips were taking on a bluish tinge that suggested hypothermia was becoming a serious concern. Medical attention was needed, and soon. But even as Jake reached for his phone to call for help, he realized that the storm had knocked out his phone lines, and his cell service had been spotty for days. His nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the roads were certainly impassable. By now, for better or worse, he was on his own with 3 mysterious children and a pack of wolves that seemed to be settling in for a siege. The oldest boy seemed to read something in Jake's expression. No one is coming, he said quietly. Not until the storm ends. Not until the wolves decide to leave. How do you know that? Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect that these children understood their situation far better than he did. Because this has happened before. The boy's English was improving as he warmed up, or perhaps he was simply becoming more willing to communicate. My grandfather told stories about times when children had to walk the old paths, and the wolves came to test them. Test them for what? To see if they were worthy. To see if they remembered the old agreements. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Old agreements suggested traditional knowledge, spiritual practices, ceremonies that connected these children to beliefs and customs that predated modern Montana by centuries. But it also suggested that their presence here was not accidental, and that the wolves outside were not simply animals following their hunting instincts. The little girl spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. The oldest boy listened, then looked at Jake with an expression that seemed far too serious for someone his age. She says thank you for protecting us, but she wants to know if you understand what that means. What protecting you means? Jake asked. It means you are part of the story now. It means when the wolves test us, they will test you too. And if we fail, if any of us fail, people will die. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and Jake could hear scratching sounds on his porch that suggested the wolves were moving closer to the house. He looked at the 3 children who had stumbled out of the blizzard and into his life, carrying with them questions he could not answer and responsibilities he had never asked for. The injured boy was leaning heavily against the wall now, his face pale with blood loss and cold. The little girl had moved closer to the fire, but she was still shivering despite the warmth. The oldest boy stood watching Jake with the kind of attention that suggested he was measuring him for something, testing him in ways that had nothing to do with his willingness to offer shelter from a storm. Jake Martinez had spent 5 years on this remote ranch trying to escape the complicated moral universe he had inhabited as a police detective, where every choice carried consequences for people he would never meet, and every decision required weighing competing claims of justice and mercy and practical necessity. He had thought that tending cattle and fixing fences would be simpler, cleaner, a life where right and wrong were as clear as the difference between a healthy animal and a sick one. Now standing in his living room with 3 children who spoke of old agreements and wolves that tested worthiness, Jake realized that he had been naive to think he could ever escape the kinds of choices that defined who he was when everything else was stripped away. The question was not whether he would help these children. That decision had been made the moment he opened his door and let them inside. The question was whether he would have the courage to face whatever test the wolves outside represented, and whether he would survive the discovery of what protecting these children really meant. Because as he looked into the oldest boy's dark eyes, Jake understood that this was not a random encounter, not a simple case of being in the right place at the right time to help children in distress. This was something that had been building for longer than he knew, something that connected his past as Detective Martinez to his present as Jake the rancher, something that would require him to become more than either of those men had ever been. The scratching on his porch grew louder, more insistent, and Jake realized that whatever was about to happen, it would test not just his willingness to protect 3 vulnerable children, but his understanding of what protection actually meant. When the wolves at your door were hunting for something deeper than flesh and blood, the oldest boy moved to the window and peered out at the pack arranged around the house. When he turned back to Jake, his young face was grave with knowledge that seemed to belong to someone much older. The big one, the leader, he is waiting for you to make a choice. What choice? Whether you will fight the old way or the new way. Whether you will trust what your grandfather's grandfather knew, or only what you learned in the world of badges and laws and courts. Jake felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized that these children knew things about him that he had never told anyone in Crow Valley, things about his past that he had buried beneath 5 years of quiet ranch work and deliberate isolation. How do you know about my grandfather? How do you know about my work before I came here? The boy did not answer directly. Instead, he said, some stories are older than the people who tell them. Some agreements are older than the countries that try to govern them. And some tests come to the people who are ready for them, whether they know it or not. Outside, the wolves began to howl in unison, a sound so haunting and beautiful and terrifying that it seemed to vibrate in Jake's bones. The little girl started to cry, not from fear but from something that looked almost like homesickness, as if the wolf song reminded her of something she had lost. The injured boy tried to stand and immediately collapsed, his leg no longer able to support his weight. Jake realized that whatever spiritual or cultural significance this encounter might have, he was dealing with immediate practical problems that required immediate practical solutions. One child was going into shock from blood loss and hypothermia. Another was small enough that the cold could kill her within hours if her body temperature dropped any further. And all 3 were clearly exhausted, hungry, and traumatized by whatever experience had brought them to his door in the middle of the worst storm in recent memory. Jake had learned long ago that when faced with competing demands, you addressed the most urgent first and worried about explanations later. Right now, keeping these children alive was more important than understanding how they had come to be running through a blizzard in traditional clothing, while being pursued by an unusually organized wolf pack. He carried the injured boy to his couch, examining the leg wound by lamplight. The cut was deep but clean, probably from a sharp rock rather than claws or teeth. It would need stitches, but Jake had basic medical supplies from his years of treating injured livestock. More concerning was the boy's core temperature, which seemed dangerously low despite the warmth of the house. The little girl had curled up by the fireplace, still shivering despite being close to the flames. Jake brought her a heavy wool blanket and a cup of hot chocolate, which she accepted with the polite gratitude of a child who had been taught proper manners, even in desperate circumstances. The oldest boy remained by the window, dividing his attention between the wolves outside and Jake's efforts to treat his injured companion. As Jake cleaned and bandaged the wound, the injured boy spoke in halting English. "My name is Tommy. This is my sister Anna and my cousin David. We are from the Blackfeet Reservation, but we were not supposed to be there tonight. We were supposed to be somewhere else, doing something else. But the dreams told us to walk the old path instead." "Dreams," Jake repeated, not sure if he was dealing with delirium from blood loss or something more significant. "What kind of dreams?" Tommy's eyes focused on Jake with surprising clarity. "Dreams about a man who used to catch bad people, who came to live with the animals because he was tired of catching people, who were never as bad as the people who never got caught. Dreams about wolves that came to test whether he remembered what his own grandfather knew about protecting children who carried old wisdom." Jake felt the world tilt around him as he realized that whatever was happening here went far beyond coincidence or chance encounter. These children had not stumbled onto his property by accident. They had come here deliberately, guided by knowledge or intuition, or something that defied rational explanation, and they had brought with them a test that he was not sure he was prepared to face. David, the oldest boy, finally left his post by the window and approached the couch where Jake was finishing the bandage on Tommy's leg. "The wolves are not going to attack tonight," he said with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "They are waiting to see what kind of man you are. Tomorrow, when the storm ends and we have to leave, that is when they will decide whether to let us pass or whether to stop us." "Why tomorrow?" Jake asked. "What happens tomorrow that is different from tonight?" David looked at Tommy and Anna, clearly weighing how much to explain to this stranger who had opened his door to them, but who might not understand the larger forces at work. "Tomorrow, the tribal police will come looking for us, and the federal agents who have been watching our families, and the people who think they own the land where the old ceremonies are supposed to happen." "Federal agents," Jake repeated, feeling familiar warning bells going off in his mind. Why would federal agents be looking for 3 children? "Because we were supposed to be in government custody tonight," Anna said quietly, speaking English for the first time since arriving. "Because our family signed papers that said we belonged to the boarding school now, that we had to forget the old ways and learn to be proper American children." The pieces began clicking together in Jake's mind with sickening clarity. Federal boarding schools for native children were supposed to be things of the past, historical atrocities that modern America had acknowledged and moved beyond. But Jake had spent enough years in law enforcement to know that official policies and actual practices did not always align, especially when it came to communities that lacked political power and economic influence. "We ran away," David continued, 3 nights ago when they came to take us to the new school in Billings. Our grandparents told us about the old paths through the wilderness, the routes our ancestors used when they needed to disappear from soldiers and settlers and government people who wanted to change us into something else. But the old paths have guardians," Tommy added, his voice growing stronger as the warmth began to restore his circulation. "Wolves that test travelers to make sure they deserve protection. That is why they followed us here. To see if we are worthy of the old safety. And to see if you are worthy of protecting us," Anna finished, looking at Jake with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated wisdom about the cost of trusting outsiders with precious things. Jake sat back on his heels, processing what the children had told him. If their account was accurate, he was not dealing with a simple case of kids lost in a storm. He was dealing with children who had fled federal custody, who were being pursued by law enforcement agencies, and who believed that their safety depended on passing some kind of test administered by wild animals that seemed to possess human-level intelligence and purpose. As a former police detective, every instinct he had told him to call the authorities, to report the children's location, to trust that the system would protect vulnerable kids better than one isolated rancher could. But Jake had learned through painful experience that systems designed to protect the innocent did not always function as advertised, and that sometimes the people who needed protection most were the ones running from the very institutions that claimed to serve their best interests. Outside, the wolves had moved closer to the house. Jake could see them through his living room window, dark shapes arranged in a perfect circle around his property. They were not showing any signs of aggression or hunger. Instead, they waited, with the infinite patience of creatures that understood something about this situation that Jake was only beginning to glimpse. The pack leader had positioned itself directly in front of the house, its yellow eyes fixed on the windows with an intensity that suggested it was not just watching, but evaluating. When Jake met its gaze through the glass, he felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with previous encounters with wild animals and everything to do with the sense that he was being measured for qualities he was not sure he possessed. David moved to stand beside Jake at the window. "He knows you," the boy said quietly, "the wolf leader. He has been waiting for you for a long time." "Waiting for me?" Jake felt reality shifting around him like sand. How could a wild animal be waiting for someone it had never met? "Not waiting for Jake Martinez, the rancher," David explained. "Waiting for Miguel Martinez, the policeman who learned that sometimes protecting people means breaking laws that were written by people who never intended them to protect everyone equally." The use of his real name, his former name, hit Jake like a physical blow. These children knew things about his past that he had never shared with anyone in Montana. Things about the case that had ended his career in Denver and driven him to seek isolation in the wilderness, where questions about identity and justice seemed simpler. "How?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect that the answer would challenge everything he thought he knew about coincidence and causation, and the possibility that some encounters were orchestrated by forces larger than individual choice. Anna spoke up from her position by the fire. "Our grandmother dreams about people sometimes. People who are important to stories that have not finished being told yet. She dreamed about a policeman who would learn to be a protector, who would face wolves and remember what his blood knew about defending children when the law could not." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the valley, burying familiar landmarks under drifts that would take days to melt. Inside Jake's house, 3 children who carried mysteries he could not solve waited for him to decide what kind of man he would choose to be when morning came and the larger world began looking for them. Jake looked at Tommy's bandaged leg, at Anna's small form wrapped in his largest blanket, at David's watchful eyes that seemed to see far more than any 10-year-old should. Then he looked out at the wolves that had appointed themselves guardians or judges or something else entirely, and realized that his quiet life of deliberate isolation was about to become very complicated. But for the first time in 5 years, Jake Martinez felt something stirring in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. The sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, even if he did not yet understand the full scope of what that meant. The wolves outside began to howl again, and this time their song sounded almost like approval. Jake spent the rest of the night tending to his unexpected guests while keeping watch at the windows, monitoring the pack that had settled into a patient vigil around his property. The wolves showed no signs of leaving, but they also showed no signs of attacking. Instead, they maintained their circular formation like sentries guarding something precious, occasionally howling in harmonies that seemed to carry meaning Jake could not quite grasp. Tommy's fever broke just before dawn, and his leg wound had stopped bleeding entirely. Anna had fallen asleep by the fire, her small body finally warm enough to rest. David remained awake, taking shifts with Jake at the window, the two of them watching the wilderness with the shared alertness of people who understood that safety was temporary and vigilance was the price of survival. As the first gray light of morning began to filter through the storm clouds, David shared more of their story. The boarding school in Billings was part of a new federal initiative, disguised as educational opportunity, but designed to separate Native children from their families and traditions more systematically than previous programs had managed. Children selected for enrollment were specifically chosen for their connection to tribal elders and traditional knowledge. Our grandparents taught us the old stories, the old songs, the old ways of understanding the world, David explained. The government people said that was holding us back from success in modern society. They said we needed to learn to think like Americans instead of like Indians. Tommy stirred on the couch, his fever dreams apparently filled with wolf songs and ancient voices. Anna opened her eyes and immediately looked toward the window where the pack leader maintained its vigil. She spoke in her native language, words that sounded like questions or observations, and David nodded thoughtfully before translating. She says the big wolf is not angry anymore. She says he is proud of us for finding the right person to trust. Jake did not ask how a 6-year-old girl could read the emotional state of a wild predator through a window at 30 yards distance. He was beginning to understand that these children operated according to knowledge systems that his police training had never addressed, and that questioning every unusual claim would be less productive than simply observing and learning. By mid-morning, the storm had begun to weaken, the heavy snowfall reducing to scattered flakes that danced in the pale sunlight, breaking through the clouds. Jake could see across his property again, could make out the shapes of his barn and outbuildings, emerging from the white landscape like familiar friends returning from a long journey. The wolves were still there, but their formation had changed. Instead of surrounding the house, they had arranged themselves in a line between Jake's property and the road that led back toward town. It was a defensive position, Jake realized, as if they were preparing to block access to the house rather than prevent escape from it. David noticed the change as well. They know someone is coming, he said. Someone who should not find us here. Jake checked his phone and found that service had returned with the clearing weather. He had 17 missed calls from the sheriff's office, 12 from a number he did not recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code, and 3 voicemails that he was suddenly reluctant to check. The first voicemail was from Sheriff Campbell, a decent man who had always treated Jake with the respect due to someone who paid his taxes and minded his own business. Jake, I hope you are weathering the storm okay out there. Need you to call me back as soon as you get this. We've got federal agents in town asking questions about missing children, and your property is along one of the search routes they want to check. The second voicemail was from an unfamiliar voice with the kind of crisp authority that Jake associated with federal law enforcement. Mr. Martinez, this is Agent Sarah Chun with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have reason to believe that 3 children who absconded from federal custody may be in your area. These children are wards of the state and must be returned immediately for their own safety and welfare. Please contact us at this number if you have any information about their whereabouts. The third voicemail made Jake's blood run cold. Miguel, a man's voice said, using the name that only people from his past should know. This is Danny Walsh. I know it has been 5 years, but I need you to listen carefully. Those kids who are probably sitting in your living room right now are worth a lot of money to some very bad people. Money that could solve both our problems if you are smart enough to make the right call. Think about it, partner. Think about what Detective Martinez would have done with information this valuable. Jake ended the playback and stared at his phone like it contained a live rattlesnake. Danny Walsh was supposed to be serving 15 years in federal prison for corruption and conspiracy charges related to his work with the Denver Police Department. The fact that he was making phone calls and referencing current events suggested that either he had been released early, which seemed unlikely, or that his connections reached far beyond what the federal prosecutors had understood during his trial. David was watching Jake with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adult faces for signs of danger or betrayal. "What did the voices say?" the boy asked. "That people are looking for you. That federal agents want to return you to custody. And that someone I used to know thinks you are worth money to bad people." Jake was honest because he sensed that these children had already survived enough adult lies and half-truths to last several lifetimes. They deserved to know what they were facing. Anna spoke in her native language, her voice urgent and frightened. David translated. "She says the bad people are the reason we had to run in the first place. She says they are not really interested in making us into proper American children. They want us for something else." "What else?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to develop suspicions that he hoped were wrong. "Our grandparents know things," Tommy said, his voice still weak but his mind clearly sharp despite his injury. "Old ceremonies, old medicines, old places where power is hidden. People who collect Indian artifacts and sell them to private collectors. They pay a lot of money for real knowledge about sacred sites and ceremonial objects." Jake felt pieces clicking together in his mind with horrible clarity. Federal boarding schools provided the perfect cover for cultural theft on an industrial scale. Children separated from their families and communities, isolated in institutions where they could be pressured or coerced into revealing traditional knowledge that could then be commodified and sold to wealthy collectors who treated sacred artifacts like investment opportunities. It was elegant in its cruelty, using the government's stated mission of cultural assimilation to mask what was essentially organized plunder of native spiritual heritage. The children were not just being educated in Euro-American customs. They were being systematically strip-mined for information about traditional practices and sacred locations that could be turned into profit by people who saw native culture as a resource to be exploited rather than a living tradition to be respected. The wolves outside began moving again, repositioning themselves along Jake's driveway. In the distance, barely visible through the clearing snow, Jake could see vehicles approaching. Black SUVs moving carefully through the drifts, heading directly toward his ranch with the purposeful advance of people who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find when they arrived. David saw them too. "They found us," he said quietly, "but the wolves will not let them pass easily. Not all of them are who they pretend to be." Jake felt his old police instincts awakening, the heightened alertness that came from recognizing a developing situation where innocent people were about to be placed in danger by forces larger than themselves. He moved to his gun cabinet and removed his service weapon, checking the magazine out of habit before holstering it beneath his jacket. If federal agents wanted to reclaim custody of the children, that was their legal right, regardless of what Jake thought about the ethics involved. But if Danny Walsh was somehow involved, if corrupt cops and cultural thieves were operating under cover of legitimate law enforcement, then this was about to become the kind of situation that required choices Jake had spent 5 years trying to avoid making. The vehicle stopped at the edge of his property, just beyond the line where the wolves had positioned themselves. Jake counted 8 figures emerging from the SUVs, some wearing federal agent windbreakers, others dressed in tactical gear that suggested they were prepared for resistance. Through his binoculars, he could see that several of the men were carrying tranquilizer weapons alongside their standard firearms. Tranquilizers suggested that they wanted the children alive and unharmed, which was reassuring. But it also suggested that they expected to encounter resistance, which was less reassuring. People who were simply executing a routine recovery of runaway children did not usually come equipped for a military operation. The pack leader rose from its position in the snow and moved to block the driveway, its massive form creating an obstacle that no reasonable person would try to drive around. The other wolves flanked it, forming a living barrier between the approaching agents and Jake's house. What happened next defied everything Jake thought he knew about animal behavior and human law enforcement procedures. Instead of trying to go around the wolves, instead of using noise or vehicles to scatter the pack, the lead agent stepped out of his SUV and began walking directly toward the pack leader. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the kind of careful respect that suggested he understood exactly what he was dealing with and had experience managing similar encounters. The wolf and the agent faced each other across 10 feet of snow-covered ground, two apex predators from different worlds taking each other's measure. Jake could not hear what the agent said, but he spoke for several minutes, his body language suggesting negotiation rather than confrontation. The pack leader listened with the attention of an intelligent being processing complex information. Then something impossible happened. The wolf nodded. Not the kind of incidental head movement that might be mistaken for acknowledgement, but a clear, deliberate nod of understanding and agreement. The pack began to withdraw, moving back toward the tree line with the same coordinated precision they had shown while surrounding the house. The agent returned to his vehicle, and the convoy advanced up Jake's driveway as if nothing unusual had occurred. As if federal law enforcement officers routinely negotiated territorial agreements with wild animals before conducting official business. As if the natural world and the human world operated according to shared protocols that Jake had never been taught, but which others apparently understood perfectly. David watched the approaching vehicles with an expression that mixed resignation with something that might have been relief. "Now we will see what kind of protection you can really offer," he said to Jake, "and whether the wolves were right to trust you with us." Jake realized that whatever test the children had spoken about was about to begin in earnest, and that his performance would determine not just their immediate safety, but something larger about justice and protection and the ancient agreements that governed relationships between those who had power and those who needed shelter from its abuse. The lead agent who stepped out of the black SUV was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in difficult places dealing with difficult people. She wore a Bureau of Indian Affairs jacket and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But there was something else in her demeanor, a careful respect as she approached Jake's porch that suggested she understood the delicate nature of the situation she was walking into. Agent Patricia Winters introduced herself through the front door that Jake opened, just wide enough to speak without revealing the children inside. She spoke with the professional courtesy of someone following established protocols, but Jake could hear undertones of genuine concern in her voice when she mentioned the missing children and the dangers they faced in the wilderness during such severe weather conditions. "Mr. Martinez," she said, and Jake noted that she used his current name rather than his former identity. "We have reason to believe that 3 children from the Pine Ridge area may have sought shelter on your property during the storm. These children are in federal custody for their own protection, and we need to ensure their immediate safety and return them to appropriate care facilities." Jake studied Agent Winters through the partially open door, using skills developed over 12 years of police work to read the subtle indicators that separated legitimate concern from bureaucratic convenience. Her body language suggested genuine worry about the children's welfare, but the tactical team behind her suggested preparation for resistance that seemed disproportionate to a simple recovery operation. "What kind of protection requires removing children from their families?" Jake asked, keeping his voice neutral but his meaning clear. Agent Winter's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Martinez, these children were removed from an unsafe situation where they were being exposed to practices that federal child welfare specialists have determined to be harmful to their development and integration into mainstream educational systems. The boarding school placement is designed to provide them with opportunities their current environment cannot offer. The careful phrasing told Jake everything he needed to know about the gulf between official policy and actual practice. Agent Winters might genuinely believe she was acting in the children's best interests, but her definition of those interests had been shaped by people who viewed native, cultural practices as obstacles to be overcome rather than traditions to be preserved. Behind Agent Winters, Jake could see other figures moving around the vehicles, and he recognized the types immediately. Federal agents, local law enforcement, and at least 2 men who carried themselves with the predatory alertness of private contractors or mercenaries. The mix of official and unofficial personnel suggested that this operation involved interests beyond simple child welfare. David appeared beside Jake at the door, his small form barely reaching Jake's shoulder, but his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the conversation. Agent Winter's expression softened when she saw the boy, the genuine concern of an adult who cared about children's welfare overriding the bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized her initial approach. "David," she said gently, "we've been so worried about you and Tommy and Anna. Your families have been terrified that something happened to you in the storm. We're here to take you somewhere warm and safe where you can get proper medical attention and food and care." David looked up at Jake, then back at Agent Winters, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone far older than his 10 years. "Agent Winters, you are a good person who believes she is doing good work. But the people who sent you here are not good people, and the place you want to take us is not safe for children who know the old stories." The agent's face showed confusion, mixed with professional concern. "David, I understand that change can be frightening, especially for children who have been through trauma. But the educational opportunities at the Billings facility will give you skills and knowledge that will help you succeed in the modern world. Your family signed the custody agreements because they want what's best for your futures. Our families signed papers because men with guns told them their children would disappear forever if they refused." David replied matter-of-factly. "They signed because those same men demonstrated what happened to families who did not cooperate by showing them photographs of the Clearwater family, who have not been seen since they refused to send their daughter to the school in North Dakota." Agent Winters stepped back slightly, her professional composure cracking as David's words sank in. Jake could see her processing the implications, her mind working through the possibility that the operation she was part of was not what she had been told it was. "David, those are very serious accusations," she said carefully. "If you have evidence of threats or coercion involving federal custody arrangements, that needs to be reported through proper channels immediately." "To who?" David asked. "The same federal agents who told our tribal council that cooperation with educational initiatives would ensure continued funding for reservation programs. The same Bureau of Indian Affairs officials who coincidentally began asking detailed questions about sacred sites and ceremonial objects right after our family signed the custody papers." Jake watched Agent Winters' face as she absorbed what David was telling her. He could see the moment when professional skepticism began competing with growing understanding, when the pattern of coincidences started forming a picture that challenged everything she thought she knew about her mission. Tommy appeared in the doorway behind David, moving slowly but under his own power, his bandaged legs supporting his weight adequately. Anna followed, staying close to her older companions, but watching the adults with the careful attention of someone who had learned that grown-up conversations often determine children's fates without consulting the children themselves. "Agent Winters," Tommy said, his voice still rough from fever but his words clear. My grandmother told me something before we left the reservation. She said that good people sometimes work for bad systems without knowing it, and that the hardest thing in the world is helping good people see that they are being used to hurt the people they think they are protecting. Agent Winters looked at the three children standing in Jake's doorway, taking in their traditional clothing, their obvious exhaustion, and the quiet dignity with which they faced a situation that should have terrified any normal child. Jake could see her training warring with her instincts, her professional obligations competing with growing suspicion that this operation was not what it had been presented to be. Agent Winters, Jake said quietly, how many children have been enrolled in these boarding school programs in the past 2 years? I don't have exact numbers, she replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. The program is expanding as more families recognize the educational benefits. And how many families requested this placement voluntarily, without any federal pressure or incentives? Agent Winters was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her mentally reviewing case files and enrollment procedures, looking for patterns she might have missed or explanations she might have accepted too readily. I would need to review the documentation to give you accurate statistics, she said finally. Agent Winters, Anna said in her clear, high voice, the men in the back trucks, the ones who are not wearing uniforms like you, do you know who they work for? The agent turned to look back at her convoy, and Jake saw her notice for the first time the configuration of vehicles and personnel that surrounded her official operation. The tactical team members who carried equipment that seemed excessive for a child recovery mission. The unmarked vehicles with government plates but no agency identifications. The men who stood apart from the federal agents and local police, watching the house with the kind of professional interest that Jake associated with private military contractors. Those are security specialists, Agent Winters said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Additional personnel to ensure the safety of all involved parties during transport. David and Tommy exchanged glances, communication passing between them in the silent language that siblings and close friends develop over years of shared experience. David spoke to Anna in their native language, rapid words that sounded like instructions or warnings. Anna nodded and moved back into the house, out of sight of the agents outside. Agent Winters, David said, if we agree to come with you, will you promise that we will be taken directly to the billing school and nowhere else? Will you promise that we will be allowed to contact our families within 24 hours? Will you promise that we will not be separated or transferred to other facilities without our grandparents' knowledge? The questions were posed with the precision of someone who had learned to identify the gaps in official promises, and Jake could see Agent Winters struggling with how to respond. Standard procedure probably did not require her to make specific commitments about custody arrangements to the children involved. But David's question suggested that previous promises had been broken and that trust was not something these children extended easily. I can promise that you will be taken to appropriate facilities where your welfare will be the primary concern, Agent Winters said carefully. That is not the same as promising we will go to the place you told our families we would go, Tommy observed. That is the kind of answer adults give when they are going to do something different from what they said they would do. Jake felt admiration for these children's ability to navigate adult deception while maintaining their own integrity. They were not being defiant or disrespectful, but they were refusing to accept vague assurances when their safety depended on specific commitments. It was a level of sophistication that spoke to hard-won experience with systems that claimed to serve their interests while actually serving other agendas. One of the unmarked vehicles had moved closer to the house, and Jake could see through his side window that its occupants were setting up equipment that looked like surveillance gear. Not the standard tools for a child recovery operation, but the kind of sophisticated monitoring devices used for intelligence gathering or long-term observation. Agent Winters, Jake said, I think you should ask yourself why your support team is installing surveillance equipment to recover 3 children who are standing right here willing to talk to you." The agent turned to follow Jake's gaze, and he could see her professional composure beginning to crack as she noticed details about her own operation that she had apparently not been briefed about. The tactical positioning that seemed designed for siege warfare rather than child welfare. The equipment that suggested long-term monitoring rather than simple transport. The personnel who carried themselves like mercenaries rather than social workers. "I was told this was a routine recovery," she said slowly, speaking more to herself than to Jake or the children. "Standard protocols for children who had fled federal custody during dangerous weather conditions." "Agent Winters," David said gently, "routine recoveries do not require negotiating with wolf packs. Routine recoveries do not involve men who carry the kind of weapons your team is carrying. And routine recoveries do not happen when children have information, that's certain. People want to buy and sell." The wolves had withdrawn to the tree line, but they had not left entirely. Jake could see them moving through the forest that bordered his property, maintaining visual contact with the house while staying beyond the range of the tranquilizer weapons that several agents carried. The pack leader remained visible at the Fido edge of the clearing, watching the human drama unfold with the patience of a creature that understood the larger patterns at work. Agent Winters walked back toward her convoy, ostensibly to coordinate with her team, but Jake could see her engaging in what looked like increasingly heated conversations with the other officials. Through his binoculars, he watched her body language shift from professional cooperation to growing agitation as she asked questions that apparently did not receive satisfactory answers. "She is beginning to understand," David observed, standing beside Jake at the window. But understanding and being able to act on understanding are different things. "She has supervisors who will not be pleased if she does not deliver us to the people who are paying for our delivery." Jake turned away from the window to face the 3 children who had brought so much complexity into his carefully simplified life. "David, I need you to tell me the truth about something. When you said your grandmother dreamed about me, when you knew things about my past that I never told anyone here, how is that possible?" David sat down on Jake's couch, his young face serious with the weight of knowledge that seemed too large for someone his age to carry. "My grandmother is Mary Crow Feather. She is what some people call a medicine woman, but that is not exactly right. She is someone who remembers the old ways of knowing things, the ways that do not depend on telephones or computers or government records. But she knew specific details about my work in Denver, about cases I worked on, about the reason I left law enforcement." Tommy spoke up from his position by the fire. "Grandmother does not dream about facts. She dreams about spirits, about the shape that people's spirits make when they are struggling with difficult choices. Your spirit has been carrying the weight of a choice you made to protect children, when the law said you should protect the people who were hurting them." Jake felt his carefully constructed distance from his past beginning to crumble. For 5 years, he had told himself that his decision to leave Denver was about personal burnout, about wanting a simpler life away from urban complexities. But Tommy's words cut through that comfortable fiction to the truth he had been avoiding. The Ramirez case had been his last as Detective Miguel Martinez. 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 12, found living in conditions that could only be described as torture, subjected to abuse that federal prosecutors later called some of the worst they had ever documented. The perpetrators were a ring of wealthy individuals who paid premium prices for access to vulnerable children, protected by political connections and legal technicalities that kept them beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Jake had spent 18 months building a case that should have resulted in life sentences for everyone involved. Instead, he had watched evidence disappear, witnesses recant their statements, and key suspects walk free because they had resources and connections that transformed the justice system from a mechanism of accountability into a tool for protecting the privileged from consequences. The final blow had come when his own department ordered him to cease investigation, citing concerns about jurisdictional overreach and the need to maintain cooperative relationships with federal agencies that had their own interests in the case. Jake had been told to close his files and move on to other assignments, to trust that justice would be served through channels he was not privy to. Instead, Jake had made a choice that ended his career and nearly landed him in federal prison. He had gathered every piece of evidence he had collected, every witness statement and financial record and surveillance photograph, and delivered it directly to investigative journalists who had the independence and resources to publish what law enforcement agencies would not pursue. The resulting expose had brought down the entire network, resulting in arrests and convictions that the official investigation had failed to achieve. But it had also marked Jake as someone who could not be trusted to respect the boundaries between law enforcement and media, someone whose loyalty to abstract justice was stronger than his loyalty to institutional authority. The internal affairs investigation had been thorough and brutal, questioning not just his professional judgment, but his psychological fitness for police work. The final report had concluded that Detective Miguel Martinez suffered from an unhealthy obsession with cases involving children and demonstrated a dangerous willingness to circumvent proper channels when his personal moral convictions conflicted with department policy. Jake had resigned before formal disciplinary action could be taken, but the damage to his reputation and his sense of professional identity had been complete. He had saved 3 children from continued abuse, but he had done so by becoming the kind of cop that other cops could not trust, the kind of officer who put personal conscience above departmental loyalty. Your grandmother dreamed about that choice, Jake said, understanding beginning to dawn. About what it cost me and why I came here. David nodded. She dreamed about a protector who had learned that sometimes protecting people means standing against the systems that claim to protect them. She dreamed about wolves that would come to test whether he had learned the difference between following rules and following truth. Anna climbed down from her chair by the fire and approached Jake with the fearless curiosity of a child who had been taught to see adults as potential allies rather than automatic authority figures. She spoke in her native language, words that sounded like questions or observations, and David translated. She wants to know if you are afraid of the men outside. Jake considered the question honestly. I'm concerned about what they might do if they think I'm not going to cooperate with their plans, but I'm not afraid of them personally. Anna nodded as if this was exactly the answer she had expected to hear. She spoke again, and David's translation made Jake's heart skip. She says the wolves are not afraid of them either. She says the wolves know the difference between people who protect children and people who collect them. Through the window, Jake could see Agent Winters in increasingly animated conversation with the other officials. Her gesture suggested frustration, possibly anger, and the responses she was receiving seemed to be hardening her expression rather than providing satisfactory explanations. One of the tactical team members was pointing toward the house and making hand signals that Jake recognized as preparations for forced entry. David, Jake said urgently, I need you to tell me exactly what you think is going to happen when those people decide they're done talking and ready to take action. The boy looked out at the convoy, then at the wolves positioned along the tree line, then back at Jake with eyes that held knowledge no child should possess. Agent Winters will be told that her concerns about proper procedures are noted, but that operational necessities require immediate action. The tactical team will approach the house while she is kept back for her own safety. They will take us into custody using whatever force they think necessary. And then we will be transported not to the Billings School, but to a private facility where people who pay money for access to traditional knowledge will have the time and privacy they need to extract what they want from us. Tommy added, "The boarding school story is for people like Agent Winters, people who need to believe they are doing good work. The real operation is about stealing what our grandparents know and selling it to collectors who think our medicine and our ceremonies are curiosities they can own." Jake felt the familiar burning in his chest that he had learned to associate with the moment when abstract injustice became personal responsibility. The same feeling he had experienced when he first saw the Ramirez children's medical records. When he understood that the system he had sworn to serve was being used to facilitate the very crimes it claimed to prevent. "How long do we have before they stop talking and start moving?" he asked. David consulted some internal calculation that seemed to involve factors beyond simple tactical assessment. "The wolves will give us a sign when it is time to choose. Until then, we wait and prepare. Prepare for what? To discover what kind of protector you really are when the testing begins." Agent Winters was walking back toward the house now, her expression grim with whatever conclusion she had reached during her conversation with the other officials. Behind her, the tactical team was spreading out in a formation that suggested they were preparing to surround the house and cut off any possibility of escape. But something else was happening at the edge of the clearing. The pack leader had risen from its position among the trees and was moving toward the convoy with the deliberate pace of an animal that had made a decision. The other wolves followed, not in attack formation, but in the same coordinated line they had maintained while blocking the driveway earlier. Jake watched through his window as the impossible happened for the second time that morning. The wolves positioned themselves between Agent Winters and her tactical support, not aggressively but unmistakably, creating a barrier that no reasonable person would try to cross. The pack leader sat down directly in Agent Winters' path and looked at her with the same measuring intelligence it had shown Jake earlier. "David," Jake said slowly, "are those wolves protecting you, or are they protecting me?" "They are protecting." "The choice you are about to make," David replied. "The choice about whether to trust Agent Winters enough to tell her the truth about what is really happening here, or whether to trust the tactical team enough to let them take us without resistance." Agent Winters had stopped walking and was staring at the wolf pack with an expression that mixed professional bewilderment with dawning recognition that this situation was unlike anything her training had prepared her for. She spoke into her radio, presumably requesting guidance about how to proceed when wild animals had inserted themselves into a federal law enforcement operation. "What truth?" Jake asked David. "What should I tell her?" "Tell her to look at the license plates on the unmarked vehicles. Tell her to ask her superiors who authorize the private contractors and what their specific role is supposed to be. Tell her to call the billing school and ask to speak with other children who were enrolled in the program over the past year." Jake understood immediately. David was not asking him to reveal classified information or interfere with a legitimate operation. He was asking him to help Agent Winters ask questions that would reveal whether the operation she thought she was participating in was the same operation that was actually taking place. The wolves maintained their position between Agent Winters and the tactical team, and Jake could see the agent struggling with a situation that had moved far beyond her understanding of normal procedures. She was clearly a competent professional who cared about doing her job correctly, but she was also beginning to realize that her job might not be what she had thought it was. "Agent Winters," Jake called through the still open door, "before you make any decisions about how to proceed, I think you should ask yourself why wild animals are acting like they understand federal law enforcement procedures better than your support team does." The agent looked at him, then at the wolves, then back at the unmarked vehicles where men in tactical gear were having increasingly urgent conversations about how to proceed. Jake could see the moment when her professional skepticism overcame her institutional loyalty, when she decided that asking difficult questions was more important than maintaining operational efficiency. What she discovered when she started asking those questions would determine not just the fate of 3 children who carried traditional knowledge in a world that wanted to commodify it, but the fate of Agent Patricia Winters herself, a career federal officer who was about to learn that some forms of corruption were so sophisticated that they turned good people into unwitting accomplices in crimes they would never knowingly support. Agent Winters returned to the house 20 minutes later with her professional mask completely removed, replaced by an expression of barely controlled anger and growing horror. She approached Jake's door alone this time, leaving her official escort standing by the vehicles in what appeared to be increasingly tense discussions about operational procedures and chain of command authority. "Mr. Martinez," she said through the door, "I need to speak with you and the children privately. I have reason to believe that this operation is not what I was told it would be." Jake opened the door wider, allowing Agent Winters to step inside where she could see David, Tommy, and Anna gathered around his kitchen table like refugees planning their next move. The agent looked at the children with new eyes, seeing not runaway wards of the state, but potential victims of something much more sinister than bureaucratic overreach. "I made some phone calls," Agent Winters said without preamble. "The Billings school that these children were supposed to be enrolled in? It closed 18 months ago due to funding issues. The facility that my orders reference as their destination is a private residential institution that specializes in what they call cultural integration therapy for indigenous youth," David translated quietly for Anna, whose English was more limited than her companions. The little girl's face darkened with understanding, and she spoke rapidly in their native language, words that sounded like warnings or curses. "She says the therapy place is where children go to forget who they are, so they can be made into something else," David explained. "She says our cousin Lisa was sent to a place like that 2 years ago, and when she came back, she could not remember our grandmother's songs anymore." Agent Winters sat down heavily in one of Jake's kitchen chairs, the weight of her discoveries clearly taking a toll on her professional composure. "The private contractors who are supposed to provide security for transport. They work for Heritage Acquisition Services, a company that specializes in what they call cultural preservation through documentation and artifact recovery." "What does that mean in plain English?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to develop suspicions that he hoped were unfounded. "It means they are in the business of identifying, acquiring, and selling Native American cultural materials to private collectors, sacred objects, ceremonial items, traditional knowledge that can be packaged and sold to wealthy individuals who collect indigenous artifacts, like some people collect rare coins." Tommy shifted on the couch, his injured leg obviously causing him pain despite Jake's medical attention. "Agent Winters, did your phone calls tell you how Heritage Acquisition Services gets the information they need to find sacred objects that are supposed to be protected by federal law?" The agent's expression grew even grimmer. "According to the documentation I was able to access, they employ cultural consultants who have detailed knowledge of traditional practices and sacred site locations. Children who have been educated in specialized residential facilities where traditional knowledge can be properly documented and preserved." "Documented and sold," David corrected quietly. "Preserved for people who can afford to own pieces of our culture that are not supposed to belong to any individual person." Jake felt familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to risk his career in Denver when he discovered that institutions designed to protect vulnerable people were actually facilitating their exploitation. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking in its cruelty, using federal child welfare programs as cover for cultural theft on an industrial scale. "Agent Winters," he said carefully, "what exactly were you told about your role in this operation?" "I was told that 3 children had fled federal custody during dangerous weather conditions and needed to be recovered for their own safety. I was told that additional security was necessary because the children's families had been making Threats against federal personnel. I was told that specialized transport was required because of cultural sensitivities around traditional clothing and artifacts that children might be carrying. Each piece of her briefing had contained enough truth to be plausible while obscuring the larger agenda at work. Agent Winters had been recruited for this operation specifically because her record showed genuine concern for child welfare and a history of successful work with Native communities. Her presence provided legitimacy and official cover for activities that would have been recognized as criminal if their true nature had been disclosed. The families making threats, Jake said. Were they threatening violence, or were they threatening to expose what was really happening to their children? Agent Winters was quiet for a long moment, clearly working through implications that challenged everything she thought she knew about her current assignment. I was told they were threatening violence against federal personnel if their children were not returned immediately. But now that I think about it, the specific threats were never detailed in my briefing materials. Because there were no threats of violence, David said matter-of-factly. Our families were threatening to contact journalists and tribal rights organizations and anyone else who would listen to them talk about children being taken from their homes and never being seen again. The scratching sounds outside grew louder, and Jake realized that the tactical team was positioning itself for immediate action regardless of Agent Winters' growing concerns about the operation's legitimacy. Through the window, he could see men in military-style gear moving around the perimeter of his house, carrying equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything needed for child recovery. Agent Winters, Anna said in careful English, the men with the special clothes and the big guns, did you choose them to come with you? No, the agent replied slowly. I was told they had been assigned to the operation for security purposes. I assumed that meant security for the children during transport. It means security for the people who do not want witnesses to what really happens to children who know traditional stories, Tommy explained. Security for the people who pay money to heritage acquisition services to learn about sacred places that are supposed to remain secret. The sound of engines starting drew their attention back to the window. Two of the unmarked vehicles were moving closer to the house, their occupants clearly preparing for the next phase of an operation that had moved beyond negotiation into implementation. But the wolves were moving too, emerging from the tree line to re-establish their protective formation around Jake's property. The pack leader positioned itself directly in the path of the approaching vehicles, its massive form creating an obstacle that could not be ignored or driven around. But this time, instead of the patient waiting they had shown earlier, the wolves displayed signs of agitation that suggested their tolerance for human planning and preparation was reaching its limits. Agent Winters spoke into her radio, requesting clarification about operational parameters and expressing concerns about the safety implications of proceeding with child recovery, while wild animals were displaying protective behavior around the target location. The responses she received were clearly not satisfactory because her professional composure finally cracked entirely. "This is Agent Winters," she said into her radio, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had decided that following proper procedures was more important than following orders. "I am suspending this operation pending clarification of jurisdictional authority and verification of destination facility credentials. These children will remain in protective custody at this location until proper documentation can be reviewed." The response from her radio was immediate and heated, voices Jake could not identify, demanding immediate compliance with existing orders and threatening professional consequences for operational delays. Agent Winters turned off her radio and looked at Jake with an expression that mixed determination with fear. "Mr. Martinez, I think I just ended my career with the Bureau of Indian Affairs." "Welcome to the club," Jake said. "It's smaller than you might think, but the membership benefits include being able to sleep at night." Outside, The tactical team was receiving new orders that apparently did not require Agent Winter's cooperation or approval. Jake could see them preparing to approach the house with or without official sanction, their movements suggesting that they had shifted from a child welfare operation to something that looked much more like a military assault. David stood up from the kitchen table and moved to the center of the room where all the adults could see him clearly. "Now comes the real test," he said, his young voice carrying weight that seemed to fill the entire house. "Not just for you, Mr. Martinez, but for Agent Winters too. The wolves have been waiting to see what kind of people we are when we have to choose between safety and truth." "What choice?" Agent Winters asked. "Whether to let the bad people take us because they have official authority, or whether to trust that sometimes protecting children means standing against the systems that claim to protect them." Through the window, Jake could see the tactical team leader speaking into his own radio, receiving instructions that were apparently different from the orders Agent Winters had been given. The Heritage Acquisition Services personnel were setting up equipment that looked like mobile communication arrays, suggesting they were preparing for an extended operation rather than simple transport. Tommy struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg but moving with determination toward the window where he could observe the developing situation. "They are not going to wait much longer," he said. "The wolves know this, and they are preparing for what comes next." Anna spoke in her native language, rapid words that carried obvious urgency. David listened, then turned to the adults with an expression that mixed childish fear with adult understanding of impossible choices. "She says our grandmother is coming. She left the reservation this morning with our parents and some of the tribal elders. They are driving through the storm to get here, but they will not arrive for several hours. She says we have to keep ourselves safe until then, and that means trusting the people who have chosen to protect us instead of the people who have official permission to take us away." Agent Winters looked at Jake, then at the children, then at the tactical team that was clearly preparing to act without her authorization or approval. "Mr. Martinez, I joined the Bureau of Indian Affairs because I believed I could help bridge the gap between federal policy and tribal welfare. I believed I was working for an agency that put children's safety above political convenience." "And now?" Jake asked. "Now I think I have been naive about how federal agencies actually operate when there are private interests involved and significant money at stake." Agent Winters pulled out her cell phone and began taking photographs of the vehicles and personnel outside Jake's house. "If I am going to end my career by refusing to follow orders, I want documentation of exactly what kind of operation I was supposed to participate in without being told its real purpose." The pack leader rose from its position blocking the driveway and began walking toward the house with deliberate steps that suggested a decision had been reached. The other wolves fell in behind it, moving in formation toward Jake's front porch with the coordinated precision of a military unit advancing on an objective. "David," Jake said urgently, "what are they doing?" "They are coming to offer you a choice that will change everything," the boy replied. "A choice about whether you remember what your grandfather's grandfather knew about protecting children when laws and badges and government authority are not enough." Jake looked at Agent Winters, who was watching the approaching wolves with professional fascination mixed with personal terror. He looked at the three children who had brought so much complexity into his life, carrying with them knowledge and traditions that connected them to ways of understanding the world that his police training had never addressed. Outside, the tactical team was shouting instructions to each other about how to handle the developing situation where wild animals had inserted themselves into a federal operation with what appeared to be strategic intelligence and purposeful intent. Inside, Jake Martinez realized that his 5 years of hiding from difficult choices were about to end, and that what happened next would determine not just the safety of 3 children, but his understanding of what protection actually meant. when the systems designed to ensure justice had been corrupted by people who saw vulnerable populations as resources to be harvested rather than citizens to be served. The pack leader reached Jake's porch and sat down directly in front of his door, looking through the window with eyes that seemed to hold knowledge about tests and choices and ancient agreements that modern law had never learned to honor. When Jake met its gaze, he felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that connected him to traditions and responsibilities that predated his badges and his training and everything he thought he knew about justice and protection, and the price of standing against systems that had forgotten their purpose. The wolves had come to offer him a choice, and Jake Martinez, former Detective Miguel Martinez, was about to discover what kind of man he had become during 5 years of trying to escape the weight of protecting people when protection required. Breaking laws that had been written by people who never intended them to protect everyone equally. The pack leader stepped through Jake's front door as if it owned the place, its massive paws making no sound on the wooden floor, despite weighing easily 150 pounds. Agent Winters pressed herself against the wall, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon before rational thought reminded her that shooting a wolf inside a confined space with 3 children present would accomplish nothing useful. David showed no surprise at the animal's entrance, instead moving to stand beside the great wolf with the casual familiarity of someone greeting an expected guest. The pack leader lowered its head toward the boy, and David placed his small hand on the animal's neck in a gesture that spoke of communication beyond anything Jake had ever witnessed between human and wild creature. "He says the time for talking is finished," David translated, though Jake had heard no sounds that resembled speech pass between boy and wolf. "The bad people outside have decided to take us by force, and we have to choose now whether we trust the old ways or the new ways to keep us safe." Anna moved to stand on the wolf's other side, her tiny hand also resting on the animal's thick fur. When she spoke in her native language, the wolf's ears twitched as if it was listening to and understanding every word. Tommy struggled to his feet from the couch, determined not to be left out of whatever communion was taking place between his companions and their unlikely protector. Agent Winters found her voice despite the impossibility of the scene unfolding in front of her. "This is not possible. Wild animals do not enter human dwellings voluntarily. They do not show protective behavior toward human children they have never encountered before. They do not demonstrate the kind of coordinated intelligence I have been observing since we arrived here." "Agent Winters," Jake said quietly, "in the past hour you have discovered that your federal agency has been used as cover for cultural exploitation. That children under your protection were being trafficked to private facilities for information extraction, and that your professional integrity has been compromised by people who see native communities as resources to be mined rather than citizens to be served. Given all that, is a wolf with unusual intelligence really the most impossible thing you have encountered today?" The wolf turned its attention to Jake, studying him with the same measuring intensity it had shown from the beginning. But now Jake understood that the evaluation was not random curiosity. This animal was assessing him for qualities that would determine not just his worthiness to protect the children, but his readiness to accept responsibilities that connected him to traditions and agreements that predated modern law enforcement by centuries. "What does it want?" Agent Winters asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wants to know if Jake is ready to remember what his blood knows about protecting children when badges and laws are not enough," David replied. "It wants to know if he will choose the path his ancestors would have chosen, or if he will let government people take us because official authority is easier to follow than ancient responsibility." Outside, the tactical team had finished their preparations and was beginning to advance on the house. Jake could see them through his windows, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted similar operations many times before. They carried tranquilizer weapons and restraint devices, but also communication equipment that suggested they were coordinating with off-site personnel who were monitoring the operation remotely. The Heritage Acquisition Services personnel had set up a mobile command center in one of their vehicles, complete with recording equipment and digital storage systems that would presumably be used to document whatever traditional knowledge they extracted from the children once they reached the private facility. The sophistication of their operation spoke to significant financial backing and careful planning over extended periods. "Agent Winters," Jake said, "you have about 2 minutes to decide what kind of federal officer you are going to be when those tactical teams breach my door. Are you going to follow orders that you now know are designed to facilitate child trafficking? Or are you going to find the courage to protect children when protection means standing against your own agency?" Agent Winters looked at the children, clustered around the enormous wolf that had somehow become the center of this impossible situation. David with his quiet intelligence and premature understanding of adult corruption. Tommy with his injured leg and fierce determination not to be taken by people who would use his traditional knowledge for profit. Anna with her huge dark eyes that held trust in adults who had proven themselves worthy of protecting precious things. "I became a federal agent because I wanted to help people who had no other advocates," she said finally. "I joined the Bureau of Indian Affairs because I believed federal oversight could protect tribal communities from exploitation and abuse. I have spent 15 years trying to build bridges between government policy and indigenous welfare." The wolf watched Agent Winters with the same patient attention it had given Jake, as if it understood that this moment represented a choice that would define not just immediate actions, but fundamental identity. When she spoke again, her voice carried the certainty of someone who had rediscovered the principles that had originally motivated her career choice. "I am not going to let those children be taken by people who see them as sources of information to be harvested. I do not care what my orders say or what consequences I face for refusing to follow them. Some things are more important than following procedures." The tactical team leader's voice came through a bullhorn outside. "This is a federal operation. All civilians will evacuate the premises immediately while we recover children who are in unauthorized custody. Any interference with this operation constitutes obstruction of federal law enforcement and will result in immediate arrest." Jake looked at Agent Winters, then at the children, then at the wolf that had somehow become their unlikely guardian and guide. Everything in his police training told him to comply with federal authority, to trust that official procedures would ensure appropriate outcomes, to believe that the system he had once served would function as designed to protect innocent people from harm. But everything in his experience told him that systems could be corrupted, that official authority could be used to mask criminal activity, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was follow orders when following orders meant abandoning your responsibility to protect people who had no other protection. The wolf rose to its feet and moved toward the front door, its movements deliberate and purposeful. It looked back at Jake once, and in that glance Jake read invitation, challenge, and recognition all at once. Then the pack leader walked to the door and waited as if it expected Jake to follow. "It wants us to go outside," David said. "All of us together. It wants the bad people to see that we are not alone, that we have protectors who remember the old agreements about defending children, and the knowledge they carry." Agent Winters checked her service weapon, not drawing it but ensuring it was ready if needed. "Mr. Martinez, if we step outside together, if we present a united front against a federal tactical operation, we are crossing a line that we cannot uncross. Are you prepared for what that means?" Jake thought about the Ramirez children in Denver, about the months he had spent building cases that should have protected them, about the system failures that had forced him to choose between his career and his conscience. He thought about 5 years of isolation and self-imposed exile, of believing that the best way to avoid making difficult choices was to remove himself from situations where such choices were required. But looking at David and Tommy and Anna, at their quiet courage and their trust in adults who had proven themselves worthy of that trust, Jake realized that some responsibilities found you regardless of how far you ran or how carefully you tried to avoid them. "Agent Winters," he said, "I spent 5 years trying to convince myself that I could build a life where other people's children were not my responsibility. But these children came to me for protection, and the wolves came to test whether I remembered what protection really means when the people who are supposed to ensure justice have been bought by people who profit from injustice." The pack leader pushed open the door with its massive head and stepped onto the porch, turning to look back at the humans who were still debating whether to follow. Outside, the tactical team was advancing with weapons ready, prepared to use whatever force they deemed necessary to complete their mission. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. Then he stepped onto the porch beside the wolf, with Agent Winters and the 3 children following behind him, ready to face whatever test awaited. People who chose ancient responsibilities over modern authority when the two came into a reconcilable conflict. 2 years later, Jake Martinez stood in the doorway of the Crow Valley Community Center, watching 30 adults from 6 different tribes work through their evening literacy classes. The building had once been a defunct grain storage facility, but Jake and a team of volunteers had transformed it into something that served the educational needs that federal programs had failed to address honestly. David Running Bear, now 12 and growing tall like his father, helped translate for elderly students who were learning to read English without being forced to abandon their native languages. Tommy Crow Dog worked as a junior instructor despite his young age, his experience with traditional healing practices making him invaluable in teaching courses that connected modern medical knowledge with ancestral wisdom. Anna Little Wolf, 8 now and fierce with confidence, served as the center's unofficial ambassador to visiting families who were still suspicious of any educational program that involved outsiders, regardless of their stated intentions. Her presence reassured parents that this place honored their children's cultural identity rather than trying to erase it. Agent Winters, now former Agent Winters, ran the center's legal advocacy program, helping tribal families navigate federal bureaucracies that had been designed to be deliberately confusing and intimidating. Her inside knowledge of government procedures made her invaluable in protecting families from the kind of cultural exploitation that had nearly claimed David, Tommy, and Anna. The confrontation at Jake's ranch had ended with arrests that reached into the highest levels of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Heritage Acquisition Services. The federal investigation that followed exposed a network of corruption that had been systematically looting Native American cultural heritage for over a decade, using child welfare programs as cover for activities that violated both federal law and international treaties governing indigenous rights. Jake had testified before Congress about the operation, describing how federal agencies had been infiltrated by private interests that saw tribal communities as sources of valuable intellectual property to be acquired and monetized. His testimony, combined with evidence gathered by investigative journalists and tribal rights organizations, had resulted in policy reforms that required independent oversight of all federal programs involving Native American children. But the real victory had not been the arrests or the policy changes or the congressional hearings that made national news for 3 weeks, before being forgotten by media outlets that moved on to other scandals. The real victory had been much smaller and more personal, measured in individual lives that were allowed to continue following paths that honored both tradition and adaptation. David was excelling in his studies while also learning traditional ceremonies from his grandmother, Mary Crow Feather, who had become Jake's unofficial advisor in matters involving the intersection of law enforcement and tribal sovereignty. Tommy had developed into a gifted healer who combined modern medical knowledge with traditional plant medicine. His leg injury having healed completely, but leaving him with deeper understanding of how trauma could be transformed into wisdom. Anna was learning to read and write in 3 languages while also studying the ancient stories that connected her to generations of women who had carried cultural knowledge through periods when such knowledge was forbidden by law and punishable by imprisonment. She often spoke of becoming a teacher like Jake, someone who could help children learn without forcing them to choose between their heritage and their future. The wolves still visited Jake's ranch occasionally, usually during significant weather events or when the children were staying with him during school holidays. The pack leader had aged visibly in the 2 years since their first encounter, but it maintained its role as guardian and guide for children who carried responsibilities larger than their individual lives. Jake had learned to communicate with the great wolf through methods that had nothing to do with his police training and everything to do with accepting knowledge systems that his education had never addressed. The animal's intelligence was undeniable, its protective instincts carefully focused on children who needed advocates capable of understanding threats that conventional law enforcement was not equipped to recognize. Agent Winters often remarked that her career with the federal government had been the most professionally successful and personally meaningless work she had ever done, while her current position at the community center represented the opposite equation. She earned less money and had no federal benefits, but she woke up each morning knowing that her work genuinely served the people it claimed to help. Jake had discovered that protecting children was not something you could do once and then return to normal life. It was an ongoing commitment that required constant vigilance against systems that evolved new methods of exploitation as quickly as advocates developed defenses against existing threats. But it was also work that connected him to purposes larger than individual success or personal comfort. The most profound change had been in his understanding of what justice actually meant when it was practiced by people who remembered that laws were supposed to serve human welfare rather than institutional convenience. The old agreements that David had spoken about were not historical curiosities, but living principles that guided relationships between those who had power and those who needed protection from its abuse. That evening, as Jake locked up the community center and prepared for the drive back to his ranch, he found a message on his voicemail from Danny Walsh, who had been released from federal prison after serving only 18 months of his sentence. The message was brief and threatening, reminding Jake that some debts never got forgiven and that people who interfered with profitable operations eventually faced consequences for their interference. Jake deleted the message without concern, understanding that some threats were empty noise designed to create fear rather than actual promises of retribution. But he also understood that the work he had chosen, the responsibility he had accepted, would continue to attract opposition from people who profited from the exploitation of vulnerable populations. Driving home through the Montana darkness, Jake thought about the path that had brought him from Detective Miguel Martinez to Jake Martinez the rancher to Jake Martinez the educator and advocate. Each identity had taught him something about the relationship between power and responsibility, about the cost of protecting people when protection required personal sacrifice. The wolves were waiting for him when he reached his ranch, 7 dark shapes arranged around his property in the same protective formation they had maintained for 2 years. The pack leader approached his truck as he parked, and Jake rolled down his window to acknowledge the greeting of a friend and ally whose intelligence and loyalty had never wavered. In the distance, he could see lights in the community center, where evening classes would continue until late, where adults were learning skills and children were learning stories, where traditional knowledge was being preserved and shared rather than stolen and sold. It was not perfect, and it would never satisfy everyone who had opinions about how indigenous education should be conducted. But it was honest work done by people who understood that protecting children meant more than keeping them physically safe. It meant ensuring that they had the opportunity to become who they were meant to be, rather than what other people needed them to become. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.